Good evening, everyone. So thanks everyone for coming out this evening. Michael Shuman is going to be speaking tonight on local economies. This is our third in our speaker series on the topic of economics, the biosphere, and human behavior. Sponsored by Minnesota 350. Metro IBA, which is the local affiliate of the American Independent Business Association, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design Sustainable Design Program sponsor, helps us use this wonderful venue, and Twin Cities Transition Towns. One of the things that Minnesota 350 is part of is what we're thinking is quite possibly going to be the biggest climate protection event in history. September 21st, we're organizing quite a few buses from Minneapolis. If you're interested in attending this historic event, please check our website. Sean Gashevsky is going to make a brief announcement here.
Hello, I'm Sean Gashevsky with the Alliance for Sustainability, and we're hosting an event with Grand Aspirations and AfroEco in a couple weeks over by McAllister. It's called the Cooperative Solutions Convergence, and so all the folks around the Twin Cities that are starting new urban farms, groups working on food processing, like the Hub Bike Co-op, as well as community solar gardens. And we're going to be getting folks working on green economy that are trying to form small co-ops together to share ideas and how to strengthen their work. So if you can join us, you can learn how to be a better consumer of these new small co-ops or start your own small business to create value while saving the earth at the same time. So just check out the flyer and just make sure to sign up online because we need to find out how much food to buy for the event. So great to meet you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Please consider supporting Minnesota 350 by becoming a sustaining member. It'll help us do more events like these, and then we're working on many different fronts, working to address climate change, so you can help us be more effective. We're very efficient with your dollars, so please consider that. And then my last comment before introducing Michael is there's been a fair amount of energy and enthusiasm around this speaker series. And so if there are anyone in the audience or you know of someone that would be interested in coming together in a group to explore possibly how to turn this energy into actions, please contact me. You can send me an email at kurt@mn350.org, K-U-R-T. But we've had a lot of good energy around this series, and so how can we turn that into action? So Michael Shuman is an easy guy to introduce. National author, wrote the book Local Dollars, Local Cents. In my opinion, Michael is one of the nation's leading minds on local economies. Been involved in a lot of important legislation, writing the seminal pieces for different pieces of legislation. So Michael's going to have a great talk for us, so please join me in welcoming Michael Shuman.
All right, I'm going to let you take care of that. Thank you. Perfect, thank you. All right. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, Kurt, and thanks all of you for taking time out of your evenings to join us here tonight. It's been an interesting journey for me over the last, 15 years while I have been working on this subject. I've written 3 books on local economies. I'm now working on a 4th. When the first book was published, Going Local, in 1998, the first event that I went to was at the University of Kentucky, and 2 people showed up for it. One left early. And one had a sense that it was going to be a long, hard journey to talk about local economies at that point. And fortunately, things have really changed. There is not a single community in the United States where you walk into where you do not see some sign boasting, "We sell local food, this is a local bank, come join us with our community currency." The signs you never see is, "We are not local, buy from us." And that is a real mark of change that I think we've effected. So what I would like to share with you tonight is a little bit from my book, Local Dollars, Local Cents, and a little bit about what is working in the local economy movement. So called this How Minnesotans Can Move Their Money from Wall Street to Main Street. And I'm going to talk for, an hour and a little bit of change, and then there'll be lots of time for questions and comments afterwards, so just to give you a sense of the flow of the evening. Where I'd like to begin is that my sense is we actually know how to do economic development. It's not a mystery anymore. We know that there are 3 basic rules for community prosperity. The first is to maximize local ownership of business. The second is to maximize local self-reliance. And the third is to spread models of triple bottom line success. Now notice that I do not say that the goal of economic development is to attract or retain. And that is one of the perverse phrases that one will hear from almost any economic development department in the United States, often at a baud rate when you're having a conversation of, say, once per minute. And what's odd about the formulation that economic development is about attract and retain is because they're talking about attracting and retaining non-local business. You cannot attract a local business. That is a complete oxymoron. And if the only way you retain a local business is by paying it some kind of bribe, how local, how connected is that business? So it really underscores that economic development, by and large, is heading in the total wrong direction. And these principles that all of us are working on really ought to be the framework of a new kind of economic development. So I want to share some of the evidence around each of these points. So the first rule, we ought to maximize local ownership. This graph here comes from a study that was done about a year ago by the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and it was an analysis of all retail and restaurant establishments in British Columbia. And what the study found was that when you look at how money flows from the businesses back into the province, when you look at independent businesses, something like 45% of every dollar spent stays in British Columbia, whereas when you look at chain retailers or chain restaurants, it's about 18 cents. In other words, it's about 2.5 times greater an impact when you spend $1 at a local establishment. That means that for every dollar you spend at a local business, it's 2.5 times the jobs, 2.5 times the income and the wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections, 2.5 times the charitable contributions. We're not talking about small bits of difference. And this study also showed that if there was a 10% shift from chain to local spending in the retail and restaurant sector of British Columbia, they would create nearly 30,000 new jobs. I'll take questions at the end, okay? And please, so write down your questions, and the more intense you feel the questions, write it more intensely. So there is a summary here of about 24 studies that have been done over the last 10 years. And these studies have all pretty much come to the same conclusion. Every dollar spent at a local business generates 2 to 4 times the economic development benefits than what you get from a non-local business. It's a very robust finding, and there is not a single study that has shown otherwise. You don't have to take my word for it. In the Harvard Business Review in 2010, there was this study done by Harvard economists that was a regression analysis of several hundred regional economies in the United States. And what they found was that per capita job growth was correlated with the presence of small businesses in the community. And then there's this study that came out of the Federal Reserve in Atlanta about a year ago that shows that per capita income growth is correlated with the presence of local businesses in your community. And this was analyzing all the counties in the United States. So we know that local businesses are not only important for jobs, but are important for eradicating poverty. There's a whole mess of other studies that I don't have time to go into. We know that local businesses are critically important for smart growth. Smart growth is all about density. It's about getting people out of their cars, creating walkable communities. You cannot create a walkable community with big box hellholes. It just doesn't spatially work. And when you think about it, if we're trying to create mixed-use communities, the only way of doing it is to have more and more of our businesses small, increasingly home-based, so they fit naturally into environments that are multi-use. There are studies that show that tourists are interested in the unique aspects of local businesses, local restaurants, local hotels, local shops. We know that local businesses are what promote entrepreneurship in society. There is evidence now that local food businesses, by promoting fresh and healthy food, are good for public health. In fact, in Cleveland, where I'm going to show you some results of a study I did there a few years ago, the Cleveland Clinic, one of the premier health institutions in the US, has made local food one of its priorities. We have evidence from political science literature that local business communities have higher degrees of participation, both in elections and as volunteers in the charitable sector. When you put all these things together, it is really, really hard to understand what the hell economic development is doing, because this evidence is so overwhelming, and yet economic development is systematically ignoring the things that we know work. Rule number two. Rule number two is maximizing local self-reliance. Now, this kind of flies in the face of the way some scholars talk about trade and the international economy, about globalization. So I want to clarify something here. My argument is not that a community does well by isolating itself from the global economy, but that a community does well by reaching into the global economy with a base of local businesses. Think of it this way. The strongest economy is going to sell as much as it can from its businesses locally and globally. Those are the two things, right? And you take one of those things away, and your economy is missing something. Well, one of the mistakes of conventional economic development is assuming that if you just focus on the global sales side of the picture, the local sales side takes care of itself. And in point of fact, what we know is the causality works in exactly the opposite direction. If you nurture hundreds or thousands of local businesses, many of them naturally start to reach out to regional, national, and global markets. And they don't need subsidies in order to do that. I want to give you one example of a community that became very wealthy using this strategy. And it's the story of a delicatessen in Ann Arbor called Zingerman's. Zingerman's was established about 25 years ago, and in the first 10 years they were very successful. They then had a very difficult decision. They had managers that they wanted to move into higher positions, or they knew they were going to lose them, so they knew they needed some growth. Were they going to grow into a national chain like Schlotzsky's? They decided against it for two reasons. First of all, was quality control. They cared deeply about the quality of the stuff they sold out of the deli. And as Paul Saginaw, one of the founders of Zingerman, said, the last thing I want to do in my declining years is fly around the country and see second-rate versions of myself. The second reason was the relationships. What they loved about working at the deli was coming in, schmoozing with the customers. They didn't want to lose that. So they decided, rather than growing broad, they would grow deep. And they would grow deep by looking systematically at things coming into the deli and things coming out of the deli, and creating new local businesses around it. So, for example, the delicatessen served bread for sandwiches, so they created a bakery. It served coffee, so they created a coffee roasting company. It served ice cream and cheese, so they created a creamery. And then looking at things coming out of the deli, they had great food, so they also created a sit-down, higher-end restaurant called the Roadhouse. They created a mail-order cake business. And then they created a training module for other local businesses called Zing Train. So in all, Zingerman's is now 10 independently owned businesses. Each one of these 10 businesses has its own set of partners. They co-license the brand, and the partners meet together for quality control. Zingerman's is now responsible in Ann Arbor for 670 jobs. And their annual sales are now topping $50 million a year. One of the things that I love about the Zingerman story is that economic development would have pronounced it impossible. Because economic development says, look, the key to prosperity is you find your global niche and you dig deep in that niche. So if you're Detroit, you're autos, or if you're Ann Arbor, maybe because of the University of Michigan, you're biotech. There was no global niche in Ann Arbor around food before Zingerman's came on the scene. They created a niche from scratch. And that's what local economy building is all about. It's ignoring the advice of economic developers and building those niches to make you as self-reliant as possible. The other thing that's kind of fun about the story is that it wasn't led by the Economic Development Department. It wasn't led by politicians at all. It was led by one business. And increasingly, economic development around the country is being led by people like ourselves. We have to put the mainstream economic developers out of business by doing things that work. The third rule of prosperity is to spread triple bottom line businesses. And I think this one's pretty obvious, so I don't need to dwell on it very long. If you look around the country, or frankly, even look around Minnesota. I think this is the one issue that people have sort of the deepest political divisions around. And conservative communities say, high labor and environmental standards are a disaster for business, and progressive communities say the absence of these standards is a disaster for business and disaster for the community. Well, here's where I know there is absolute consensus among all these communities. If you go to any of these communities and say, look, would you rather have full employment with high labor and environmental standards or full employment with low labor and environmental standards, you'd get a unified answer. Everyone would like it all. Well, all of us know businesses where you can get it all. We buy things from them every day. And so increasingly our mission is to teach other businesses how to do their models in a more sustainable, more labor-friendly way. And that teaching, that kind of partnership, is another key for building prosperity in a community. Now, the good news is that most economic developers, at least when you put a few drinks in them and they have a moment of clarity, will concede all the points I've just shared with you. But then they'll say, but Shuman, wait a minute, okay. If we have two apples here, a local apple and a non-local apple, same price, same quality, same convenience, of course, that local apple will get us more jobs, more tax revenues, more entrepreneurship, more political participation, your whole list. But these apples are not the same. The local apple is almost always more expensive than the non-local apple. Bigger is better. Bigger box is cheaper. Bigger businesses achieve bigger economies of scale. I want to share just a couple of slides that I think show you that these arguments are ridiculous. The first slide is looking at where jobs are in the economy between 1998 and 2008. So basically, during the glory decade of globalization, where globalization was sweeping the country. Now, if it were true that local businesses were becoming less competitive, we would have seen jobs moving out of the local business sector and into the global business sector. But here's the record. So the bottom stripe is firms with 500 or more employees. So all of the global companies pretty much are in that stripe. The blue stripe is medium-scale businesses with 100 to 500 employees. The green stripe is under 100 employees. And then the black stripe is self-employed people, no employees at all. So a couple of interesting things about this chart. The first interesting thing is when you put all those things together, you realize there's been no change whatsoever in the global business sector. Actually, when you look at say the last 5 years, there's been a loss of jobs in that sector. But looking over the 10-year period, there has been almost no change. So think of it this way. Even though we have massive biases in law and public policy against local business, some of them we'll talk about shortly, even though economic development has been systematically subsidizing global business to the detriment of local business, local businesses have done pretty well. It shows how resilient the sector is. Imagine if we had gotten public policy half right. There would have been a massive increase in jobs in the local business sector. The other thing that I wanted to point out to you here is that when you lay out the jobs in the economy this way, what you see is that the majority of the jobs and the majority of the output is actually in the local business sector. Now, the second thing that I wanted to point out in terms of competitiveness is on profit rates. Surely, those businesses with the highest profit rates are the ones that are most competitive. The IRS produces data every year on tax returns. The most recent data set available is from 2008, which I just crunched the numbers on a couple of days ago. And remarkably, sole proprietorships, which most local businesses either are or start out as, have profit rates that are 11 times greater than C corporations, with partnerships falling in between. Now, we don't have good data like these that the Canadians produce, but the Canadian data, most recent data on the profit rates in their firms, is that the highest profitability is in firms with 10 to 20 employees. And the lowest profit rates are on the firms being traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And I think this is probably true in the United States as well, but we don't have good enough data to really document that quite yet. But I'm looking for ways to do it. Now, surely we would be investing in these companies. We'll come back to that in a moment. And if you think local businesses have been competitive so far, in a way, you ain't seen nothing yet. So the graph that I have up there shows the breakdown of the economy between services, which is the green stripe, and then goods of two kinds. Non-durable goods is the orange stripe, and then durable goods is the purple stripe. And it starts out in 1960 and goes to the year 2000. So one of the things that you can observe is that when I was a kid, in the late 50s and early 1960s, you know, the sort of Mad Men period, 2/3 of my family's purchasing was goods, and 1/3 was services. Today, that's flipped. And that trend is happening in every wealthy country in the world. So from the standpoint of sustainability and worries about, overuse of material resources, this is great news. It just shows that people are beginning to be less concerned with goods overall and more concerned with services like education and healthcare, things that relate to the quality of life. But the real good news here for local economies is that services are where local businesses have long had a competitive advantage. People want to buy local goods and services from folks they trust. Local services, so I'll talk about the goods in a moment. You know, it's true there's a little bit of internet stuff that is pulling people away to services online, but that's not a very big factor. It's pretty trivial, actually. I don't know how many of you get your massages online. It's very popular in Washington, D.C., but we're a little weird that way. On the good side of the picture, I draw this distinction, and most economists draw this distinction between durable and non-durable goods. So durable goods are things like, your iPhone or automobile, things that last a long time. Non-durable goods are things you consume a lot of relatively frequently, and that would be things like food, building materials, paper stuff. The interesting characteristic of the vast majority of non-durable goods is that they weigh a lot and they have a relatively low dollar value per unit weight. So think of food as primarily water, except if you're talking about French wine. So in other words, you don't want to haul water halfway around the planet but you might be willing to haul scotch, okay? So you got to draw some distinctions here. Well, what this means is that if you believe, as I think most of us in this audience do, that oil prices, even if they're dipping a little bit this year or that year, they are headed upward. And as oil prices rise, as transportation prices rise, we are going to see economies of scale for regional manufacturing return to the United States. And frankly, it's already begun to happen. This, in my view, is one of the reasons we see the flourishing of the local food movement. But we're seeing it in other categories of manufacturing as well. So really the only stuff that I think is going to remain outsourced out of the United States that we're going to be importing from maquiladoras for the foreseeable future are the durable goods, the electronics. There are a bunch of other trends that are moving toward localization. I just want to mention one more, and that is the spread of home-based businesses. And if I went back to that chart, you would have seen that that black stripe on the top actually was growing by several million over the last 10 years. So I, like about 30 plus other million Americans, have been a home-based business for much of my professional life. Here are my 3 assistants, Rachel, Adam, and Dog. And it has advantages, where you can integrate home life and professional life. But the great thing, the really great thing about the spread of home-based businesses, much of it facilitated by the internet, is that in rural areas, think of, more remote communities in Minnesota that used to be dependent on mining or agriculture, that's what the economies were all about. Now these economies can be much more diversified. If I want to be a stockbroker, I can move to a remote area anywhere in the United States. And as long as I have internet communication, I can be that stockbroker. So the options that are available for small towns have tremendously expanded. So I want to shift right now to what we can do to build local economies. So I think I've given you, arguments, very, very specific arguments about why those 3 rules can benefit community prosperity. How then can we take action in order to fulfill those 3 rules? So to make it an easy checklist, I've got a list here of 6 kinds of actions. All of them begin with the letter P. Planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policy making. Planning means you identify economic leaks in your economy. All of the places where residents, your neighbors, are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services. And then you help plan how to create new businesses, local businesses, that plug those leaks, that keep more of the money circulating in your economy. People means, how do you generate a new generation of entrepreneurs or workers who are prepared to populate those leak-plugging businesses? Partners. How do you get local businesses to work together so they are more competitive as a team? Purse. How do you harness local savings and put that to work in local businesses? Purchasing. How do you spearhead think local first or buy local or 10% shift campaigns? And policy making. I have a really simple goal for policymakers when it comes to local business. Stop destroying them. Especially stop destroying them in the name of economic development. Creating a level playing field is a key goal here. I want to give you a couple of examples of each of these, just so you get a feel for it. So, an example of planning is 3 years ago, I wrote with 2 other two other scholars a study for Metro Cleveland called the 25% shift. And we analyzed what would be the impacts of the residents of Metro Cleveland shifting their purchases 25% from non-local food to local food. And among the other findings that we had was that it would create 27,000 new jobs, enough in principle to reemploy 1 in 7 unemployed workers in Cleveland. It would generate about $1 billion of new wages. It would improve the budgets of the state and local governments in Ohio by about $250 million. So it, pretty significant kinds of impacts. And the whole reason for doing studies like this, whether it's on food or the economy generally, is to really demonstrate to all the people who think attract and retain is the only option available, to demonstrate just how much more powerful these kinds of tools really can be for the bottom line of your economy. People. We're seeing a proliferation around the country of incubators, many of them kitchen incubators to support local food businesses. Partners. Tucson Originals is a collection of local food businesses in Tucson, Arizona, that for better part of a decade have been collectively buying foodstuffs, kitchen equipment, dishes, and by buying things collectively, by buying in bulk, they bring down the unit price and thereby enable all of the constituent businesses to be more competitive. How about setting up more of a kind of buyers collaborative among businesses in the Twin Cities, local businesses? Purchasing, and I'm skipping purse because that's where we're going to be most of the rest of the evening. Purchasing, I want to give you 2 examples of my favorite tools promoting local purchasing right now. The top one is a card in Portland, Oregon called Supportland. It is a loyalty card that is held and used by 70,000 residents in Portland right now. And every time you use that card at one of 200 participating local businesses, you rack up loyalty points that are good for gifts, discounts, other benefits at the other businesses. And this has been a home run success. Below is a debit card from a neighborhood in San Francisco issued by a credit union there called Bernal Bucks. And the local business network in Bernal Heights worked with the credit union to issue this card. Now, debit cards typically have fees that come back to the issuing financial institution based on each transaction. The credit union actually agreed to surrender a big chunk of their fees to the local business alliance. And the local business alliance then uses that money to teach people in their network how to use the card more effectively at local businesses. So about 80% of the transactions done with this card are at local businesses. What's really cool about both of these cards is that they pay for themselves. They pay for the staff people who administer them. So one of my concerns about the sort of typical buy local programs, lots of signs, lots of, we're a local business, directories, parties, debates, and so forth, they cost money and there's no revenue flow to cover them. These are business ideas that actually are performing economic development objectives. So I call these businesses, these kinds of business ideas, pollinators, because they pollinate other businesses as they become more successful. And that actually is what my next book is about that I'm working on now. It's about dozens of these emerging pollinator businesses all around the United States. Policymaking. There's a lot to be said about policymaking. Let me just point to one issue that irritates the hell out of me. Local and state procurement standards. Now, we know that the vast majority, again, or I shouldn't say vast majority, some majority of our economy is local business, and yet a significant minority of local businesses are the only ones that get government contracts. So something is going wrong in the contracting process. And I think one of the things that goes wrong is that we don't give due credit to local businesses that circulate their money in the local economy. So in other words, if you can show that business A, has a certain bid, but all of the spending that they're going to do with that contract is out of state, and business B that maybe has a slightly higher bid is spending all of their money in state, you should calculate what the difference is in taxes that you're collecting, because that's part of the bottom line for the state. And there is nothing problematic from a legal standpoint of looking at full cost accounting. And when you take into account the differential taxes that come from a local business versus a non-local business, then you would start to get fair kinds of bidding and fair kinds of choosing in the contracting world. Now we come to the purse category. And frankly, this to me is the single biggest problem that faces local businesses. It is the problem of capital. And the problem has many dimensions, but the biggest dimension, sadly, is you and me. Let me explain what I mean here. So by show of hands, I think we have enough light to see hands. By show of hands here, how many people have mindfully bought something locally over the last week? Okay, all the hands have gone up. By show of hands, how many people here do their banking at a local bank or credit union? Okay, a couple of hands didn't go up. We'll beat you up afterwards. Now, by show of hands, how many of you with pension funds have at least 1% of your pension money going into local business? All right. So, this is outrageous. You folks should be ashamed of yourselves. You folks, some of the most important advocates of local economies in one of the most local economy states in the United States are systematically over-investing in Fortune 500 companies you distrust and under-investing, that is putting no money whatsoever, in the companies you care about. Something is deeply wrong with this picture. And what's deeply wrong with this picture is this guy. We have a system of law in this country that was enacted in the 1930s called securities law. And securities law created a system which I would call investment apartheid. If you're this guy, in the top 1% of income earners or wealth holders in the United States, you are allowed to invest in anything, anytime, no questions asked. If you're in the other 99%, you may only invest a penny or more, but even a penny, you can only put a penny into a local business if it has gone through an extensive set of filings called disclosures that often cost, from a local attorney, $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000. And what do these disclosures really get you? Well, you get a thick booklet, 200 pages long. Oftentimes they're written in 8-point font, all caps. And as you read through, every single page says some variation, if you understand them, which almost no one does. But if you understand them, every single page says, you will lose everything. You will lose everything. Everything you will lose. So we basically have created this empty policy of declarations that make attorneys very wealthy, and I say this as an attorney, ratting on my fellow attorneys, but they no longer serve a meaningful function in disclosing anything to people. But what they really have done is they've created a monopoly for all of our capital on Wall Street. The total amount of money that is in our long-term savings, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance funds, stocks and bonds, is about $30 trillion. $30 trillion. And almost all of that is either going to Fortune 500 companies or government bonds. Which leads me to this point. If we had an efficient and working capital marketplace, half of that long-term capital would go to the half of the economy that's local business. I mean, I think that's pretty apparent. We've already established that local businesses are at least half the economy. They're at least as profitable. They certainly are competitive and increasingly competitive. Surely that money belongs in Main Street. So what I think we should start to anticipate and work toward is a $15 trillion shift from Wall Street to Main Street. And that works out to about $50,000 for every resident of the Twin Cities. What I'd like to talk with you about now is some of the specific ideas about what you can do to shift your money. And these are things that are being done right now, and I have sort of a baker's dozen of things to share. So the first thing to share is around banking. I think most of you understand that it is important to shift your money into local banks and credit unions. And the reason is that it is much more probable that a dollar you put it on deposit in a local banking institution will be used to support a small business than a dollar put on deposit in, say, Bankasur of America. But all banks, big and small, local and non-local, are pretty stingy with their money. They're pretty conservative. And so some communities have approached their local banks and said, look, we want you to be a little bit looser in making some loans to businesses we really care about. So here's what we're going to propose to you. We're going to bring you some new depositors. And we're going to put that money on deposit in a segregated account. And that money will 100% collateralize new loans that you give to businesses we choose. You administer, we choose. If the businesses do great, you get administrative fees. If the businesses do poorly, you get administrative fees. What do you think? So the banks and credit unions that have been seriously approached on this have actually thought it's a pretty good idea. So this picture is of Equal Exchange Coffee. And Equal Exchange Coffee is a worker-controlled fair trade company based in Boston. They approached their local bank and said, how about we create a special certificate of deposit that supports just fair trade-related loans. And by the way, we're the only fair trade company that you have a banking relationship in Boston, so really this is about supporting us. The bank thought it was a good idea, went ahead with it. They started producing marketing materials to say, we are the only fair trade bank in the United States. And as a result, Equal Exchange now has a $1 million line of credit. Which leads one to start thinking, why not approach banks and credit unions in the Twin Cities and say, how about creating a special certificate of deposit for food businesses, or for energy businesses, or for manufacturing businesses. Number 2, co-op investment. This is a picture from Weaver Street Market in Carrboro, North Carolina. Weaver Street Market is a food co-op with about 13,000 members. And when they needed to build a third store, they borrowed funds from their members. And, at a time when most savings accounts were paying a fraction of 1%, they were paying their members 6, 7, 8% for the privilege of borrowing their money to build the third store. And what we're seeing is that over the years, co-ops have been one of the sectors that has been practicing local investment. And when you want to look around in the Twin Cities for really clear, easy to understand local investment opportunities, turn to your co-ops. Number 3, LION. LION stands for the Local Investment Opportunities Network of Port Townsend, Washington. The guy pictured on the right is James Fraser, founder of LION. He was a successful hedge fund manager in New York, got very wealthy, felt guilty about it, came back to Port Townsend and decided he wanted to do some good. He decided to address a feature of securities law that we haven't really talked about so far, and that is, even if you have spent, as a local business, even if you have spent $25, $50, or $100,000 for your thick disclosure statement so you can take some money from unaccredited investors, you still may only be able to approach people with whom you have a pre-existing relationship. In other words, you can't advertise generally. So Fraser had a brilliant idea. He decided to start throwing a party once a month in Port Townsend. Port Townsend is a 10,000 person town, small town. He'd bring together local businesses and local investors. He'd ply them with free food and alcohol. And at the end of each of the parties, he would go around with a sign-up sheet and say, who do you have a pre-existing relationship with? And so he started to keep this record. And so when any business had a business plan to raise some capital, he would then know who he could share that business plan with to get those pre-existing relationships, to tap them. So just this really very modest social invention is responsible for bringing $1 million per year into local businesses in Port Townsend since 2008. That is during the time of enormous financial stress. Now, you can do the math about what this would be implying in the Twin Cities, given your population, as it relates to 10,000, if you created LIONs all over the Twin Cities. Number 4, sponsorships. So most of us are familiar with Kickstarter, Indiegogo. These are donation crowdfunding sites. So this particular offering here is the Brickside Brewery, Copper Harbor's first microbrewery in Copper Harbor, Michigan. And if you give this brewery $1, you get a thank you note. If you give it $25, you get a t-shirt. If you give it $1,000, they name the beer after you. Now, from the standpoint of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the thank you note, the t-shirt, and the beer name are not really returns on your investment. They're just gifts. So this is a total dodge of securities law. It's a clever end run around securities law. Now, of course, people said, economists would say, who the hell would give $1,000 for something for a t-shirt or a beer name? We now know that the answer is several billion dollars among several million Americans would give something for nothing, right? And that the economists were totally wrong about what motivates people in this kind of activity. And what's now happening is that there's literally hundreds of local donation knockoff sites with names like Lucky Ant, Community Funded, Small Knot, The Money Crowd. Then there are internet lending sites. So Kiva is sort of the internet equivalent of the Grameen Bank, doing micro-lending. It started facilitating microloans from people in the United States into the global South. So, you might give $100 to a micro-entrepreneur in Bolivia. You only get your principal paid back. You don't get any interest. And because you don't get interest, this, again, is not a security. So another very clever end run around securities law. Kiva has started to give loans to entrepreneurs in the United States. It's not just, for third world lending so far. Prosper and the Lending Club are totally different animals. Prosper and the Lending Club do pay interest, and they do allow unaccredited investors to put money up. In order to make that happen, though, Prosper had to invest literally millions of dollars in securities filings to make this happen. Now, my problem with most of these things, whether it is Kickstarter or Prosper or Kiva, is that every $100 you put into a micro-entrepreneur in Bolivia is $100 that you're not putting into a micro-entrepreneur in the Twin Cities. And so the next generation of these kinds of sites has got to be portals that bring together local investors and local business opportunities. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Number 6, slow munis. Many of you have heard of slow money. Many of you have heard of slow food. So slow food was started by an Italian named Carlos Petrini. He was, appalled by the spread across the West of fast food, and he thought it was important to start teaching people, again, the meaning of food in their lives. So, having slow food that emphasized quality rather than quantity, and have dinners that emphasize relationships rather than people just shoving things in their face and running to something else. Well, Woody Tash was an investment guru in the United States who was really excited about these ideas and applying these ideas to investors. So that's when he wrote a book called Slow Money, talking about the quality of investment relationships and the importance of those relationships rather than anonymous kinds of investment activities. So one of the things that they have advocated, the slow money movement, is this concept of slow munis. So munis are municipal bonds. Most cities in the United States, including the Twin Cities, issue municipal bonds. Sometimes they're for, very good municipal infrastructure projects. Sometimes they're for really dumb economic development projects like stadiums or, big corporate attractions or convincing, Target to stick around in a building here. What we're not using municipal bonds for, and should be using it for, is to help capitalize local businesses. So I have pictures here of various local food businesses in Boulder County, because I did a very similar kind of food analysis as I did for Ohio for Boulder County. And one of the recommendations that we made to Boulder County was to create food bonds. That is, to issue municipal bonds, tax-free bonds, and these bonds would bring in money that would then collateralize loans that would go to local credit unions and local banks I'm sorry. They would collateralize loans that were issued by the local credit unions and banks to priority local food businesses. Now, we made these recommendations for local food bonds, which could be purchased by unaccredited investors. We made these recommendations, around 2010, 2011. Timing wasn't quite right. The bond market was still pretty bad for most communities. But I am pleased to say that Steve Grossman, who's the state treasurer of Massachusetts, last year issued green bonds. And the green bonds for Massachusetts supports local energy businesses, local water businesses, local stormwater control businesses, and uses municipal money for those purposes. So we're starting to see municipal investments, becoming real here for good projects. Number 7, pre-selling. This is Awaken Cafe. Awaken Cafe is a great coffee house in Oakland. They needed $100,000 to move their store to a new location because they had lost their lease. The last thing they wanted to do was to waste $100,000 on lawyers, to do the disclosure statements. So they came up with a great idea. They would pre-sell coffee. And the basic deal to their customers was this: buy $1,000 of coffee today, and when the new store opens, you'll get $1,200 worth of coffee. So in other words, you'll get a 20% rate of return. Brilliant idea, and a total end run around securities law, because they did not have to do a securities filing for pre-sales. Now, there are limits to this idea, but broadly speaking, an existing business with existing goods and services can use pre-sale as another way of raising capital without disclosure statements. Number 8, local stock. When the securities laws were enacted in the 1930s, it was understood that securities regulation would be at 2 levels, a federal level and the state level. And states were permitted to oversee the regulation of any stock from local businesses that would only be held and traded by people who lived within the state. And this is called the intrastate exemption. So an example of this is the Quimper Mercantile, again in Port Townsend, which we've already talked about. So Port Townsend wanted a place, a kind of general store where they could buy socks and underwear. They didn't want to invite in a chain store. So they built a mercantile. They needed to raise about $500,000 to make it happen. They raised it from the community in small stock. You had to be a resident of Washington State to purchase the stock. And once they raised the money, they issued an advertisement that said, "Thank you to the people for making this happen." Mercantile has been operating for a couple of years now, pretty successfully. And there are mercantiles like this, local stock mercantiles, all over the country. Now, I have to say that as heartwarming a story as the Quimper Mercantile and similar things are, it bothers me deeply that they still had to do the kinds of disclosure statements that cost $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000. And it really, I started a few years ago to think seriously about what are we trying to accomplish with securities law? And, what you're often told is securities law is trying to prevent grandma from buying swampland in Florida. That's kind of that's always what you're told. We're protecting grandma from buying swampland in Florida. And I certainly concur that that is a good objective. Tomorrow I will be flying to St. Louis, where I will be visiting my 92-year-old mother. And my mother is someone I don't want to see defrauded by buying swampland in Florida. But here's something that's interesting that securities lawyers never think about. My mother spends most of her leisure time going to one of a dozen casinos in St. Louis. When she walks through the door of those casinos, do they say, excuse me, Mrs. Shuman, but have you shown us, have you proved to us that you are an accredited gambler? When she walks over to a blackjack table, sits down, do they say to her, we would love to have you play, but before you do, can you please read this 200-page disclosure statement on the risks of playing blackjack and sign here? So we have two systems of risk management in the United States. One system called gambling, where everyone can play, and chances are good you're going to lose everything, independent of your income. And we have another system called supporting local business in the name of building prosperity in your local economy. And unless you pay off lawyers $50,000 to $100,000 for disclosure statements no one reads, you can't play. Something struck me as deeply problematic about this. So I wrote a piece for a journal published by the Federal Reserve where I proposed, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and this was in 2008, a $100 exemption. My proposal was, look, at some level of money, some ridiculously small level of money, you, the securities establishment, should not care. $100. I mean, $100 is no more risky than us going for a dinner for two at a new Chinese restaurant, okay? And before I go to that Chinese restaurant, you don't require that Chinese restaurant to spend $100,000 on disclosure statements. And if you did, none of us would have Chinese restaurants, okay? So let's just agree that $100 should be a lawyer-free zone. I understand it's risky, but because it's risky, I'm only going to put my money into close local businesses I really have a lot of trust and excitement around. Well, some interesting things happened after I wrote that article. Some friends in the Bay Area wrote a rulemaking petition to the Securities and Exchange Commission for the $100 exemption. And hundreds of people from around the United States sent letters to the SEC in support of this. Well, turn back the clock about 2.5 years, and this woman, Mary Shapiro, who then was the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, was sitting in front of the Government Operations Committee, which was looking at whether or not to pass some crowdfunding reforms. And one of the Tea Party Republicans asked her, whatever became of the $100 exemption? And she said, and she was just dripping with condescension. She said, well, we get these ridiculous proposals for reform all the time. Maybe we'll convene a group in a few months and look at them and come back with some recommendations. Now, remember that at this point, 2.5 years ago, unemployment in the United States was running about 9%. And what she basically was saying, and everyone on the committee understood this, was that small businesses and small investment in small businesses does not matter. We do not care about that. And the committee went ballistic. And that committee, and I mean everyone from the Darrell Issa Tea Party Republicans to the Occupy Democrats, that committee unanimously, it was the only unanimous thing they did that year, unanimously voted not for a $100 exemption, but a $10,000 exemption. And that passed almost unanimously in Congress and went to the Senate. Now, I wasn't sure what I thought about $10,000, because there's other policy concerns that sort of kicked in. And it sort of lingered in the Senate, and this guy said, come on, guys, get it done. So they whittled it back to $2,000, and the Jobs Act was signed by President Obama in April 2012. And actually, I was sitting in the Rose Garden, took that picture from my iPhone, and it was quite an exciting moment. The Jobs Act basically said a couple of things. Said, if you're a small business and want to raise less than $1 million, we will now allow every American to contribute, well, invest, up to $2,000. And if you have more income than, sort of a low level of income, you can put more than $2,000 per company per year in. You have to do these transactions in a portal that is an internet site, and that portal has some responsibilities for vetting the company. But significantly, the cost for doing this would probably not be $25,000 for a company, but it would probably be like $5,000 to $10,000. So really bringing down the cost for companies to get money from unaccredited investors. Well, what's happened since then? Nothing. So the Securities and Exchange Commission issued rules last September, and then they had 60 days for a comment period, and then they were to be finalized. So obviously a lot more than 60 days. It's almost 6 months. Soon it will be 60 months have passed, and the SEC is just dragging its feet. And, the usual suspects are pushing the SEC to somehow try to thwart the law. So what has happened as a result of this is just remarkable. Because states have said, screw the federal government, we're going to pass our own Jobs Act at the state level. And so there's more than a dozen states that have passed reforms that are implementing the Jobs Act and greatly reducing the cost and complexity for local businesses to do intra-state offerings. Which brings me to tool number 9. No one wants to keep their money in a local business forever. And we need places where people can buy and trade their securities for these local businesses, basically local stock exchanges. And so I work part-time for a group called Mission Markets in New York, which is creating the first prototypes of these community portals. But we're waiting for the SEC, right? And until the SEC acts, we're not going to make this technology or software available. No one really can. But at some point, probably in the next couple of years, we will see these community portals proliferate. And we need a Twin Cities portal where local investors and local businesses can come together. And I'm pleased to say, yesterday there were about 40 of us who rolled up our sleeves and spent the better part of a day working on the details of how to begin creating a Twin Cities portal. So you can look forward to that. The next thing I would say is that you should not interpret any of my enthusiasm for local businesses as encouragement for you to take all of your money out of the bank right now and put it into your favorite local business. That's just dumb investment behavior. You have to treat local investment like we treat other kinds of investment now. You have to diversify and evaluate the companies very carefully. You have to create pools. Most people don't want to pick and choose stocks. Most people want to put money in an investment fund, a local investment fund. And the problem is that the securities laws governing investment companies are even more onerous, more obnoxious than those dealing with the issuance of stock. So right now we have to play with just a few little exemptions from the so-called Investment Company Act, And one of those exemptions is that a nonprofit is allowed to run a revolving loan fund for small business. And so this guy, Steve Fireman in Columbus, Ohio, has something called the Economic and Community Development Institute. He's a nonprofit. He is the great economic developer of Columbus, Ohio right now. He has a dozen revolving loan funds, and the most recent fund allows unaccredited investors to participate. So we should start spreading these kinds of funds around the country. Now, you would think that I should be able to go to my mutual fund and put money in local business. And here's the shocking bottom line. There are 7,500 mutual funds in the United States, and not a single one of them invests directly in local business. Not a single one of them. And it's not because it's not permitted in the law. It is permitted. It's just no one has taken an interest in doing it so far. So right now, your only option for investing in local funds is to go to something like ECDI. Meanwhile, people are being clever with do-it-yourself kinds of tools. So some people are creating investment clubs. And investment clubs allow groups of investors to come together, pool their money, and then collectively invest as they see fit. And the basic rule is, as long as everyone is involved in the decision-making, it's a club. The moment you say, this guy here, he's going to make all the decisions for us, you violated the rules and you can't have your club anymore. So this ad here comes from an investment club in Maine called No Small Potatoes. Has about 25 investors in it, some of them unaccredited. They've pooled together $5,000 to $10,000 each, and they give loans to their favorite local food businesses and farmers. Probably the most important tool for local investors until we reform the Investment Company Act is what I would consider a secret weapon, because no one knows about it. But it's so secret that a dummies book was written about it, called the Self-Directed Ira. And with the Self-Directed IRA, you are able to move your money from a vanilla-flavored IRA into another kind of IRA where you have a custodian and you can tell that custodian where you want your money invested. And no longer are you stuck with those 7,500 non-local mutual funds, but you can use that self-directed IRA to invest in everything we just talked about. You can put your tax-deferred IRA money into CDs, if your bank is issuing them. You can put it into your co-op. You can put it in local stock. You could put it in Steve Fireman's fund. You could put it in Prosper and the Lending Club. Really, the only thing you can't put your self-directed IRA money into is your house or your kid's house. But interestingly, you can put your self-directed IRA money into your neighbor's house. And your neighbor can put her self-directed IRA into your house. And therein lies a whole nother unexplored kind of local investment tool, which we will talk about next year. Now, where do you begin with all of this? My suggestion is that the Twin Cities ought to begin looking at some of the low-hanging fruit. And I think there is a role of things you can ask from your local officials. First thing you can ask them to do is do all of their banking at local banks and credit unions and to abandon the big banks. And if you think it's impossible, look at Portland, Oregon, because they've done it there. Second thing I would have them do, and this really goes to what we talked about yesterday, is I would have them create a list on the municipal website of every local business in the Twin Cities area that we think is looking for capital, and allowing that business to post some information. So we start to educate people in the Twin Cities when they say, we don't know of any local businesses that are looking for money. And then on the municipal website, there is this big list of businesses that are looking for things. You can't give a lot of detail, but you just give a little bit of detail. And people can follow up and figure out how to do the transactions themselves. I would also put on that site certain clicks so that you can find the providers of self-directed IRAs in the area. Another thing you could do is create a community portal like we talked about yesterday. And I think we should get the City Council of Minneapolis to perhaps pass some resolutions declaring what they would like the state legislature to do in order to change securities law in this state. So here's one idea that we were kicking around earlier today. How about a 5% tax credit for every Minnesotan that puts money, investment money, into local Minnesota businesses? Now, we have all these crazy tax credits like this all over the country supporting really dumb economic development. So it's not unprecedented. But, this kind of very modest little boost would give everyone, I think, just the right nudge to start paying attention to moving their money from Wall Street to Main Street. I want to tell you what one person could do. So I live in a suburb outside of Washington called Silver Spring. And about a year and a half ago, I got a call from this woman, Lori Charkoudian. She's a grad student at Johns Hopkins University in economics. And she said, I read your article about the $100 exemption. Seems really interesting. Why don't we try doing this in Maryland? And I get a lot of calls like this. And I thought, all right, sure, go do it. And let me know how it goes. I was very dismissive because she was not an advocate. She didn't have any. She was not like an organization or anything. Next thing I knew, about 6 months later, she told me that the bills were now sitting in front of major committees in both the House and the Senate in Maryland. And would I write testimony on behalf? Well, then she had my attention. So I wrote testimony, and these bills passed unanimously in both houses and was signed into law by Martin O'Malley. Almost no one in the country knows about this. But the result is that starting this autumn, Marylanders will be able to give up to $100 to any local business with a loan totaling up to $100,000 with no lawyers intervening whatsoever. We have implemented the $100 exemption, and you can do it as well. And to me, it's just, it's remarkable that this woman, who has no lobbying experience whatsoever, was able to create a legal movement that was unanimous in the state legislature. This is the moment. This is the moment to dream big and push big in the Minnesota legislature for all of the things, all the reforms that we're looking for. Where I want to leave you, and where I leave my book, Local Dollars, Local Cents, is with a children's book called A Blue So Blue. It's by a guy named Jean-Francois Dumont. And the book is about a kid who's obsessed with painting the color blue. And everywhere he goes, he paints blue. But there's one shade of blue that comes to him in his dreams, and he doesn't know where it comes from. It kind of mesmerizes him. And he really wants to figure out, where does this blue come from? So he sets out on an international journey to find that shade of blue. He goes to the Louvre in Paris, looks at the paintings by the masters, doesn't find the blue there. On ocean journeys, ocean liner journeys, he looks for patches of blue in the water and still can't find it. He goes to a blues bar in New Orleans, doesn't find it there. Then he shows up to a desert, and a blue-hooded stranger says to him, mysteriously, "What you've been looking for may never have been very far away." And suddenly it dawns on the boy. The blue he was looking for, the blue he had searched the world for, was the blue in his mother's eyes. And I think we so often forget that the real wealth in our economies, despite all of the hype on globalization, is right in our backyards. You've got it all right here. The purchasing power, the investment power, the political power, it is now up to you to make it happen. Thank you very much.